I would like to welcome everyone today to today's food safety webinar, Wildlife, Domestic Animals, and Land Use. This webinar will identify the basic effects of wildlife on your own domesticated animals can have on your operation and how your operation can implement basic practices to mitigate against the food safety risk animals may cause. The webinar will discuss management, monitoring, corrective action, and mitigate possible food pathogen contamination when you identify signs of animal intrusion. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers to begin to understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today's presentation is made possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. IFAI is also scheduling a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at nativeFoodSafety.org for listings of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will fill the training requirement from the Produce Safety Rule. The webinar we are hosting will help you better understand the issues and will help you prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Erin Sherrill, will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the question feature of the control panel. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Erin. Erin is the Research Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, where she supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and the analysis of legislative and regulatory issues, tribal governments, and business and individual procedures. Take it away, Erin.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon to talk about food safety and talk about specifically food safety when we're dealing with wild and domesticated animals on the farm or in the farm environment. As Nikki mentioned, we've got a whole bunch of food safety trainings that we've been doing all over Indian country. And if we've probably come near you, but if you miss this or you want to join us for a food safety training, please reach out to our team. My contact information I think will be at the end of this presentation, or you can always visit nativefoodsafety.org, the slide that's here on the screen that has that URL down there at the bottom, and send us a message. We'd be happy to come out and do a food safety training for you anytime. So with that, I will get into today's presentation on wildlife, domesticated animals, and land use when we're talking about produce safety on the farm. So today, what we're going to be discussing, again, are different kinds of ways that animals, whether they're wild animals or domesticated animals, working animals on the farm, can introduce some potential possibilities for contamination, such as like bacteria or viruses that can, if they get on fresh produce that people are going to eat raw, can make somebody potentially very sick. And we're going to talk about how to mitigate some of the risks associated with that, some co-management strategies that can achieve both food safety goals and conservation goals on your lands when you're doing farming. One of the things that we're really going to talk about today a lot as one of those risk management strategies for dealing with wild and domesticated animals on the farm in the farm environment is how to conduct a pre-plant and a pre-harvest assessment. When we're talking about wild animals, it's really important to kind of survey things and figure out what animal intrusion is going to be the most likely and some strategies that you might want to use to reduce that, but both before planting and before harvest, just to see if there's been animals in the fields that might have introduced some things that can make people sick if they get on those foods. We're also going to discuss the kind of corrective actions that you might want to take if you have any risks that you notice when you do those pre-plant or especially those pre-harvest assessment around animal intrusion. And of course, if you've watched any of the other webinars in this series, or if you've been to one of our food safety trainings, you know we're going to talk about record keeping and all of the records that you're going to want to keep in order to document all of those management strategies, as well as your monitoring and any actions that you need to take to correct any of those risks around wild and domestic animals. So just to get us started, let's talk about why animals are a produce safety concern when we're growing fresh produce that people are going to eat raw. Things like leafy greens, things like tomatoes, things like berries, things that people usually eat without cooking, because cooking is one of those things, right, that it can reduce the risk of getting sick from some kind of pathogen because it can kill that pathogen off. And if you want to know more about that, we have a whole microbiology series that you should definitely check out. We have those videos recorded on our website, and we do those webinars periodically as well. But animals do, just like us, carry pathogens. They carry bacteria, they carry viruses, bacteria like E. coli, O157H7, like Salmonella, like Listeria. Animals can carry all of those things with them, just like we can carry them when we're out in the field, if we're coming into contact with fresh produce. And animals are more of a concern because they are not going to go to a food safety training and learn how to wash their hands. They are going to, if they come through fields, they can spread pathogens by pooping in fields. If that fecal matter then gets onto leafy greens, for example, you may or may not notice that can go to the fresh market. Even if somebody washes that produce, there's a really high likelihood that it might be contaminated with something like E. coli, just for one example. So that can be one big reason that animals are a produce safety concern, and the reason that the produce safety rule under the Food Safety Modernization Act focuses on kind of reducing some of the risk around animal intrusion, just because of that risk they do represent to fresh produce. Animals obviously can be very difficult to control. There's no farm anywhere that has no animals on it. And indeed, you really wouldn't even want that to happen, right? Because animals can be a really important part of the farm environment. Just the working animals, for example, can be a very important part of the farm environment. And I know a lot of folks who have working dogs, for example, that keep predators out of their fields, away from their animals, especially if they're raising birds or something like that. So those animals can be a really important part of your strategy. They can just also, like anything else, introduce some risks. So what we're going to talk about today is that obviously keeping animals off of your farm is not entirely possible or even desirable, but there are still some ways that we can reduce some of the risks around food safety concerns when it comes to animals, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on in this module today. So before we get into that, one of the things I said we're going to talk about, right, is this idea of a pre-harvest or pre-planting assessment, rather. This is an example of one of the reasons that you might want to do a pre-planting assessment, just because, as we all know, managing food safety on the farm is incredibly complex because of all of the different moving parts. And when we're talking about moving parts in this module, we're really talking about animals moving on and over the farm that can deposit feces, that can bring in contamination, that can get on fresh produce and potentially make a consumer very ill. This slide I think is a really good example of some of the things that people might want to consider when they're doing a pre-planting assessment, because it really addresses the issue of things like runoff. So this farm has, up the hill from it, over here on the left, a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation. And the animals that are in those lots, those feed lots up there, are going to be depositing manure in those lots. And then that can all run, if you have big heavy rain or something like that, that can run from the top of the hill up there all the way down past that vegetative buffer that these farmers have going for them down here, and can get into this area where these fresh crops are being grown. So that's just one example of a way that, even though these animals are not on the farm, their runoff, their feces can still impact the farm. So, and on the other side of the hill, there's some more free range cattle. Very similar situation. It might be less runoff, but there could still be some runoff here coming down this hill. So even though there are some buffers here on either side, both bare ground and vegetative, that's still a risk potentially for this person's operation, especially if they're growing something like a leafy green that's going to be eaten raw. So what this person may want to do when they're doing a pre-planting assessment is think about what they're planting in that field. This isn't to say that you couldn't plant anything down there, and like what you might want to plant though is you might want to structure things in a way that whatever you're growing here at the bottom of these hills is going to be something that's not going to go to fresh market or something that is going to be cooked by a consumer. So a product like that is going to be way less of a risk, because even if there's a runoff that happens here, that product is probably going to be cooked before it's eaten. So not like a leafy green, probably not like a tomato, some other kind of product. Might be a better decision in the pre-planting phase to decide to maybe do something like that instead, just to reduce some of that risk. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. So wildlife, we'll start with wildlife and then we'll go into domestic animals because the produce safety rule deals with wildlife and domestic animals in two different ways. So wildlife, obviously a natural part of the world, a natural part of the farm environment. It's not something that you want to or even could possibly exclude totally from your farm. And then there are some species of animals that are protected by a lot of different laws, whether they're tribal laws, state or federal laws. And so just killing or doing anything to deter those animals, you may have some other limited management options because of protections that those animals may have on them. These animals may not always be present, which is a challenge in dealing with wildlife, especially if you've got a lot of migratory species that come over at different times of the year. So trying to adjust your management strategy for wildlife, you may have to have a couple of different plans and opportunities to think through how you want to address wildlife, because the same kind of animal may not be or on or around your farm at all times of the year. Wildlife coming into contact with any kind of human activity is going to have a greater risk of depositing some kind of contamination on fresh produce that can make someone sick, right? And the big example here, I think, would be like seagulls, as the slide says. If you've got a dump nearby you, birds may be able to go over there and feed at that landfill, and then if they fly over what they're depositing potentially onto your field, has a higher potential of contamination just because of where they're feeding and the environment there being more of a breeding ground for bacteria or viruses that are pathogenic that can make someone sick. The same situation though in the previous slide where you've got that concentrated animal feeding operation, you can have starlings or other birds that are over there that are feeding in cattle feedlots, and then they fly over the land and they can make deposits or fecal matter that they may have picked up may fall from their bodies onto fresh produce. So there's a lot of different ways you can introduce risk from wildlife, basically, is the way what the slide wants you to think about. And you're going to find, obviously, you're going to find wildlife poop in your produce fields. That's just, I think, just a fact of growing and having animals in the world, that they're probably going to, if they come into your field, they may deposit poop there. One of the things that you're going to want to think about in a pre-planting assessment or even in a pre-harvest assessment is what kind of distribution pattern that you have, and whether or not that animal has made droppings that have come into contact with fresh produce or not. The really big issue here is going to be like when that deposit happened and how large of an area it's impacting. Obviously, if you've got smaller animals that are running through, it's going to be a much different situation than a flock of birds in terms of how much coverage animals may introduce in terms of fecal matter onto fresh produce. And then there are some management practices that can limit that. You can use decoys, that'll be on a slide later, as well as netting or other things that can try to deter wildlife and keep them away from produce fields and keep them away from water sources, especially if you're using some kind of open water source like a pond, where animals can easily get into that water and leave deposits into that water that can also be a source of contamination. One of the things that the rule encourages folks to think about is co-management, which I think is something and that a lot of the native growers that we work with have already been thinking about, because native people are the original stewards of this land and have been keeping stewardship over this land for a very long time. But for farmers specifically are encouraged under the produce safety rule to think about co-management, to think about conservation. This is an area where I feel like really working maybe with people who are on the ground, whether it's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS through USDA, or folks like the Intertribal Agriculture Council's awesome network of technical assistance, maybe it will help a little bit marry food safety requirements with some co-management or conservation natural resources strategies. Because obviously what we don't want to do is remove all animals from the land, like they're a part of the land, they're a part of the farm environment, and removing them entirely, or putting up buffers or introducing other invasive species of plants to keep animals away is probably not the best strategy for conservation. But I think there's a way that we can kind of strike a balance. It's going to have to be a really unique situation. It's going to really turn on every individual farm in every individual region, which is why I really suggest working with folks like at your local NRCS office or reaching out to like the folks at the Intertribal Agriculture Council's Technical Assistance Network to figure out how to kind of make that food safety piece and that conservation piece work together. But there's definitely some opportunities in that space to support both wildlife and improve wildlife activity while keeping wildlife away from produce fields in a way that reduces risks of any kind of contamination getting onto fresh produce. There are a lot of risks, I think, in the food safety space, but they can also have an impact on conservation. Those unintended consequences that I talked about being like maybe having animals like as you're doing conservation work in inviting more wildlife to be around in an area that you're doing conservation work, that can have some conflicts between your produce safety and your conservation work, because you want the wildlife there, but you also don't want the wildlife to be running through your fields necessarily. So one of the things that we try to do when we talk through wildlife and reducing the risk around wildlife on the farm is a monitoring. And this is one of those things that the rule, if you have to follow the produce safety rule under the Food Safety Modernization Act, this is something that you're going to have to do, is just this basic monitoring, both during the growing season and then immediately prior to harvest. So that's your pre-harvest assessment, basically. Really, all the rule asks folks to do is just during the growing season, kind of keeping an eye out and having your workers keep an eye out for fecal matter in fields, any kind of evidence that animals may have been running through the fields or flying over the fields, that kind of thing you're probably going to notice, because you're going to notice maybe rooting, there may be animal tracks, some of your produce or the plants may be partially trampled, for example, if like a deer ran through, or several deer, if you live around here. Those are things that you're going to just want to keep an eye out for. And basically what you really want to think about doing, the big risk is going to come like right before harvest, immediately prior to harvest. That's when the monitoring and the assessment really needs to be the most robust, because at that point, the part of the plant that you're going to harvest and you're going to take to the fresh market to sell, the part of the plant that somebody's going to eat probably raw without cooking it, like with leafy greens, for example, that's going to be in the field at that point, right before harvest. During the growing season, that may not be true. So you're still going to want to monitor and look around to see what's going on in terms of wild animals that may or may not be on the farm, but the big risk is going to be right before harvest. So that pre-harvest assessment is pretty important, just looking to see if animals have been in the field and if they've left droppings, especially near fresh produce or on fresh produce in the case of birds especially. There are a lot of different ways that you can try to deter wildlife. I say try because we know that not everything works all of the time. Trying to fence against animals like deer may or may not be effective. Those are some things you can try. Obviously, decoys, there's several different kinds of decoys that are here, several different kinds of fencing and netting on the slide. There are other kinds of deterrents, both visual and auditory. You can have this visual deterrent. There are several different visual deterrents on here, including this wacky waving inflatable tube guy over here, that can keep wildlife away potentially. Some people try to use noisemakers that make sounds that animals don't like and will keep them away from crops. And of course, just like relocating. If you find some animals, like there's a possum here in a trap, they're gonna take and move somewhere else. That can also be a possibility. That can be also very time consuming. So I think a lot of people go more with the like visual or noise deterrent route, just because it can be a little bit less labor intensive, and when you've already got so much to do on the farm, going out and capturing individual animals may not be something that you want to do or even possible. But those are some opportunities and some options for folks thinking about how to deal with wildlife, maybe keep wildlife away from fresh produce, especially right before harvest, when it's probably going to be most attractive to animals to be in your field, because the edible portion of that produce is going to be there. Again, the reason that we focus on wildlife, even on domesticated animals like livestock, interfering in and being around fresh produce, especially right before harvest, is because there's a high potential for pathogens to be transferred from that livestock or from that wild animal onto fresh produce that can then, if it's eaten by somebody, even if they wash it off, it can be very, very hard to get rid of that contamination. It's very, very easy for bacteria, especially, to grow and propagate on fresh produce. So it can be really difficult to get rid of that contamination once it's there. So the produce safety rule really focuses on trying to minimize that risk and keep that contamination from happening on the farm. So when we're talking about wild animals, specifically, some of the things that we think about are if you have any shared grazing lands, if you have water sources that are open that attract wildlife, you may have some potential for animals to not only be on the farm, but also to have what are called contamination pathways. So basically, like if you have wild deer who are drinking out of the same pond that maybe some of the livestock are drinking out of, they can kind of cross-contaminate like between each other. So if the deer may bring something in, and then the cow may pick it up and take it back with the cow to the fields or near the fields where you may be growing fresh produce. So those are some interactions that also introduce some risks when we're talking about wildlife. Domesticated animals are not exempt from potentially harboring pathogens, just like humans, just like wild animals, livestock, and pets. Any kind of domesticated animal can also carry contamination, can bring and introduce contamination into fresh produce fields. Domesticated animals are obviously welcome in many, many fields. They're used as draft animals. I mentioned wildlife management, like some people have dogs, for example, that keep out predators for their fields. Working animals like that are an integral part of farm operations for a lot of folks. There are also people who use animals to graze and keep crop residues or eat culls. Those are also all uses for domesticated animals, and there's so many more on the farm or in the farm environment. And the produce safety rule does not say that you cannot have domesticated animals on your farm. There's no prohibition on that. What the rule asks folks to do is just kind of do a risk assessment and think about when domesticated animals are in your fields, what they're doing there, and think about the likelihood of potentially introducing some risks into your produce field. If you have a working animal in the field, again, even if it's while the crop is present as part of the production process, that's totally fine. Under the rule, you're just going to want to probably have some plans in place, especially for your workers, so that they know, for example, if you have working dogs, if they come across, if a dog has pooped in the field, your workers and anybody who's out with those animals in the field needs to know what the plan is in terms of dealing and discarding with that material, and they probably need to know that there's a potential for them to cross-contaminate as well. If, for example, they have gloves and they pick up that fecal matter that the dog has left in the field and they go discard it or throw it away, they need to change their pair of gloves probably before they go back to touching fresh produce, because that can be a way that cross-contamination can happen, and they can introduce pathogens onto that produce from their gloves now that they've handled that fecal matter. So you can definitely have working animals in the field. It's just something that workers are going to want to think about when they're out there in the field with those animals, especially keeping an eye out, making sure that the animals aren't depositing fecal matter in the fields, and if they are, knowing basically it's a poop plan is what you need at that point, just what your plan is, how you want your workers to handle that, and they need to know that they can cross-contaminate things if they touch that fecal matter with their hands, or if they step in it, then they're going to want to make sure maybe they change their shoes or scrub them off, clean them and sanitize them before they go back out into the field if they're going to be working around fresh produce for the rest of the day. If you've got production fields that are rotated into grazing land, you may have some manure that's still present on the ground. There's no really hard and fast rule on the period of time you may want to wait between when you were grazing and when you can plant produce. Again, the risk is going to be way less for planting than if you were like side dressing with raw manure, which is not something you're going to want to do, because at that point that edible portion of that fresh produce is there and available, and it's really, really easy to cross-contaminate. But again, there's no hard and fast rule. If you've got grazing land and you're rotating it out with production, you might want to give it an extra few days. If you've got a lot of rain, that may or may not help. Probably better to do it after a couple of really, really sunny days, because that sunlight can help with any kind of bacteria that may be in the field from the manure that's left over, can help that die off. Obviously, doing like rotating grazing land and production field can be a really good idea, because you can get some really rich soil that way. I'm just going to want to think about maybe extending a little bit of the time between when animals were there and when produce is going to be planted, especially if it's for the fresh market. And that's part of something that you're probably going to want to do as part of your pre-planting assessment, assessing risks before you plant. Again, that first slide that we showed with the concentrated animal feeding operation on one hill and the grazing animals on the other hill and the potential for runoff coming down to the bottom of that field. This is kind of what that slide was setting up, is looking at like where your field is located and what is going on around it. What is your adjacent land use? Do you have a CAFO uphill from you? Do you have animals that you're grazing or that somebody else is grazing uphill from you? And if there was water that came down that hill, could that have some runoff? How does that impact your risk? That's part of what your risk assessment is going to be, that you're going to want to do under the rule. And if you do have to follow the rule, you do have to do a pre-planting assessment. That is something you're going to want to do. You're also going to want to document that. But again, starting with assessing the field location, part of that is looking at the actual topography, the lay of the land, and that goes to, what kind of runoff you may have. What the wind patterns are like is another thing you're going to want to know. If things are going to be blowing potentially into your fields, what kind of contamination that might introduce. The way water moves across your land and where that water is coming from, knowing a little bit about what's upstream from you, so that you know what kind of water you might be getting downstream and what you might be introducing into your field. Like if, for example, you had a CAFO or other feeding operation, or even just animals grazing uphill, there might be some runoff in there, might be some manure in there. Just knowing that. Again, that doesn't mean you can't grow on that land at all. It's just something that you're going to want to think about and document, just so that you know that you may have a little bit more of a risk there. Any kind of other land uses that are around you, and we talked a lot about animal production being around you, but also just things like residential neighborhoods, commercial areas where there may be some chemicals, or if you have like a landfill or something like that nearby where there may be some birds that feed there and then fly over your land, that may be something to think about as well, which goes to assessing kind of your wildlife risks and thinking about what common wildlife you have near you, if there are migratory birds that fly over, what time of the year, all of those things, because all of that kind of goes to the likelihood that you might have some contamination from wild animals. And then once you kind of know what the likelihood is of contamination and what kind of animals may be introducing that contamination, you can better make a plan for how you're going to kind of reduce some of those risks through decoys, through other deterrents, all of those things. For working animals, again, it's totally fine to have working animals in the field. Obviously, the best way to the best way to minimize the risk that working animals are going to introduce contamination is to just keep them out of the field when you've got that edible portion of the crop present, which may be easy to do in the case of maybe like you've got a draft horse up here, like helping plow. Probably that horse is not going to be in the field if you've got like a bunch of leafy greens, because the horse is going to stomp all over them and you're not going to want the horse in the field at that point anyway. But that's not the case for all working animals. If you've got dogs, for example, if you have other animals in your fields that are there for working who are a lot smaller, you may have those in the field when that edible portion of the crop is present. And if that's unavoidable, then that's okay. It's just something that you're going to have a bigger risk from that animal potentially introducing some kind of of contamination. So again, you're just going to want to have a plan, and basically it's a poop plan. Your workers need to know what you want them to do if a working animal defecates in a field, either near or on produce. And part of that is going to want to be the importance of hand washing, going over that with your employees so that after they either clean up and discard that fecal matter, they know if they had gloves, they probably need to change their, or they definitely need to change their gloves. If they didn't need to wash their hands, whether or not they had gloves in either case. If they were using any kind of tool to pick up that manure that was deposited in the field, that will probably need to be cleaned and sanitized on a schedule. And just really any other time that they come into contact with an animal, probably want to really stress the importance of that hand washing, just because that can be a really easy way that cross-contamination can happen. If a worker touches an animal, touches the animal poop, and then goes back to working with fresh produce and touching it, that can be a really easy path for cross-contamination of bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens that can contaminate fresh produce. So the big standard operating procedure here is probably going to be that, like, really making sure hand washing is stressed with workers. But again, you can definitely have working animals in the field. Best not to have them there when the edible portion of that crop is present, but if it's unavoidable, in either case, just making sure you have a plan and that workers are trained on it and that they know how to deal with all of that, and that they have access to the tools that they need to carry out that plan, like a hand washing station that has soap and water and paper towels, like cleaning and sanitizing tools to be able to clean the tools that they use to deal with that animal poop. All of those things are going to be important with working animals. Pets, on the other hand, are distinguished from working animals. They should really be kept out of produce fields if they're not working animals. There are some working animals, like dogs, for example, that can be working and are also kind of considered pets. The key here is that they're in that field because they have a job, and that they're doing just like anybody else is. But if it's just a family pet, really keeping those pets out of the produce field is important, because they can carry a lot of cross-contamination, and if they're a pet, they're probably not trained to do whatever work that you have them doing in that field. So keeping them out of that produce field is going to be important. Visitors, if you have like a U-Pack operation or you do farm tours or something like that, visitors should also leave their pets at home. Those pets should not be in the field, especially because those pets are definitely not going to know what to do around fresh produce and have a really high likelihood of carrying contamination with them. This is true even if you have folks who have service animals. You don't have to allow even service animals on every single part of your operation. Like you wouldn't have to open up every single part of your operation to anybody. You're allowed to have visitors in certain areas. So there's some special guidance on service animals. If you're curious about that, we have a guidance on that on our Native Food Safety website, nativefoodsafety.org. You can read a little bit more about that if that's something that you want to read up on some more. But just to know, like, you don't have to let anybody all over your property, even if you have a guest, and that includes the service animal. But if you've got a petting zoo or any kind of as part of your farm operation, I know some people do, the key there is just to be sure that you have hand washing facilities, like sink with soap and water and paper towels available to all of your visitors, and that you're probably going to want to have some kind of food safety plan if you're doing, say, like a farm tour that involves both visiting part of that petting zoo and then walking through fields. You're probably going to, one of your standard operating procedures may be like, you have everybody go through the field first and they end with the petting zoo, and that way they're not tracking anything from that petting zoo into your fresh produce fields. And you're making sure that they have those sinks available and any kind of signs posted, keep letting people know where they can be and where they can't be when they're on your farm. So once you've done your pre-planting assessment, you have all that plan done, you've planted everything and things are growing, right before harvest, you got to do a pre-harvest assessment under the produce safety rule. And this is a good idea even if you do not have to follow the rule. This can be a good thing to do. This doesn't have to be like a hugely formal process. This is just a basically walking through and looking around and seeing right before harvest if you see animal poop in the field, where it is, if you see or notice animal tracks, if you notice like animals have clearly run through the field because things are trampled. At that point, you know that you may have a potential contamination issue from some wildlife, and you're going to want to figure out what kind of corrective action you want to take to reduce any kind of risk that anything that you harvest is going to go and potentially make someone sick once they eat it. There's no specific rule about what corrective action you have to take here if you find tracks, if you find animal trampling, if you find poop in the field right before harvest. I think that's probably a good thing because every situation is going to be different. Every instance of animal intrusion is going to be different. So you're going to want to kind of make that judgment call based on what you see when you're doing that harvest assessment. So some folks on this slide gives an example of something like a buffer zone, where you would harvest not just the part of the crop where you found that animal intrusion. So say if you're walking through and you notice like a bunch of things are trampled, there's some animal poop near some leafy greens, and you're not going to want to harvest not just what is right there and that you notice that poop has already contaminated. You might want to create a little bit of a buffer zone around it to take into account that contamination may have spread to some other things, and that can kind of minimize some of the risk of harvesting that fresh produce that may be contaminated, just creating that little buffer zone. Again, there's no specific rule for how big that buffer zone has to be. That really is again a judgment call that only you can kind of make, or only your workers can kind of make right before harvest, just based on what you're actually seeing, because the evidence of that intrusion is going to look different every time. So the solution may be different every time. In either case, no matter what you decide to do, you're going to want to document that you saw that as part of your pre-harvest assessment, and you're going to want to make a note of what you did to address the problem, what corrective action you took. And we have some record keeping templates on our website that you can download to kind of help get started with that. We'll talk a little bit about records more on the next couple of slides. But this is that corrective action. This is kind of what you do if there is contamination. The one thing that you're not going to want to do is harvest any kind of produce that absolutely has fecal matter on it. You're not going to want to harvest that and send it to the fresh market. That's going to be a no-go. But other than that, you've got options. You're going to want to think about a buffer zone. Think about how big that buffer zone might want to be. Whatever, honestly, it's going to be kind of what makes you comfortable and what fits with what you're seeing on the ground. Some people, like this slide says, like buffer zones can vary from 0 to 25 feet, depending on what the crop is, depending on what kind of contamination it is, depending on what your harvest equipment is. All of those factors matter when you're thinking about creating a buffer zone. So that's really, again, there's no specific foot radius that you have to create a buffer zone around. It's going to depend on all of those factors. And then after you take that corrective action, and after you do that corrective action, you're going to want to document all of it, what you saw and how you addressed it. And the record that you keep, I always say, like, the best record is the one that works for you. It doesn't, if it's so detailed that it makes you not want to keep that record, that's not great. And if it's so if it's so specific that, or so short that it doesn't leave you room to actually describe what you did, that may not be good either. So some kind of middle ground there that actually makes you want to keep that record and helps you quickly document everything that you did and then move on with your day. That's kind of the best record to keep. And it can be digital, it can be written, it's totally up to you. Some people take pictures and leave notes. A lot of folks just have a clipboard and a bag, or a piece of paper in a plastic bag that keeps it safe from the elements. And then they document things that way. It's really up to you as far as what the record looks like. But definitely, if you see something like that, if you see animal poop, if you see evidence that animals have been in the field right before harvest, you're going to want to write that down and write down what you did about it. Workers, we say, are your first line of defense when it comes to food safety issues, and that's true here when dealing with wild animals or domestic animals, just like any other space on the farm. Workers need to be trained in how to deal with animal intrusion on the farm. Everybody who does anything with harvest needs to know that they don't harvest anything that is contaminated with fecal matter, and that they need to be able to do kind of a basic inspection on their own and know either how to correct problems with harvest containers, with equipment, with poop that they see in the field, or they need to know who to report it to so that that person can deal with it. So if you have one specific designated person on the farm who deals with produce safety, with food safety issues, and that person needs to be reported to, workers need to know that as part of their training. Workers definitely need to know that they need to not harvest that contaminated produce, but also that, again, if they are handling animal poop, or really anytime that their hands may be contaminated, especially if they've come into contact with an animal, they need to know that they need to wash their hands, and they need to have the ability to wash their hands. So a sink and soap and water and paper towels are going to be necessary as part of that as well. And really anytime, whether there's a designated food safety person or not, workers should probably be reporting those food safety concerns to a supervisor. And I think one of the key things there is that whoever that supervisor is also needs training to know that they need to take those concerns seriously, because it's really only going to take one time for a worker to come up with like a watermelon or something that has poop on it and say, hey, what do I do with this? We can't harvest this. And this for the supervisor to not take them seriously or say, oh, it doesn't matter, just put it in the truck. And then they will never report that problem to you again. So part of that training is not just for people who are doing the harvest, but also for people who are supervising folks who are doing harvest, so that they understand if somebody brings them a food safety concern, to take that seriously and appreciate the effort that worker took to come and report that problem, because that can make someone pretty sick if that goes to fresh market. Again, a little bit on record keeping. The record keeping part that's going to be important here when we're dealing with wild animals is not just for the wild animal part, but also for that worker training. So when workers are trained, keeping a note, keeping a record that they had that training to know what to do if they come into contact with animal poop, if they come into contact with an animal, they know to wash their hands, that they had that training, that they know that they never harvest anything for fresh market that has been contaminated with feces. Those are things that are going to want to be, records are going to want to be kept for that. You're also going to want to keep records and need to keep records for your pre-planting land assessment that you do, also for your pre-harvest risk assessment that you do, just basic monitoring throughout the growing season. If you notice some animal activity, just thinking about keeping a note on that and having that being part of your record keeping as well is going to be important. Any kind of corrective action that you ever take, whether it's during the growing season, during production, or during harvest, anytime you have an animal related event that you gotta take some kind of corrective action around, whether that's a buffer zone or whether it's just have workers clean up animal poop and discard that and then wash their hands, and all of those standard operating procedures that they're following. Anytime you do anything like that, you're going to want to keep a note of that, keep a record of that. And also any kind of intrusion or any kind of animal contamination event that you have, you're going to want to keep a note of that, especially what you did about it. That corrective action is almost as important, if not more so, than making a note about the animal intrusion itself, because that's the part that's really important for you to protect you legally, and to minimize your legal risk in that instance. It's not just we documented animal poop, but we did this about it. We created this buffer zone. We didn't harvest this for fresh market because we noticed this. That's the really important part of that record. But keeping records on all of those things is going to be important. This is an example of what that might look like. This is a wildlife and domesticated animal monitoring log. This is something that you can download for free on our website, nativeFoodSafety.org. Your record does not have to look like this. If you don't like that, you can download this as a Word document and you can modify it however you want. If this works for you, awesome. If not, like, make it your own, or don't use this, use something totally different. This is kind of probably the basic information that you're going to want to keep down though, whatever format you choose to keep it in. So just in summary, we worry about wild animals and domesticated animals in produce safety because they, just like anybody else, like us, like workers, can introduce some contamination into produce and water. Animals, particularly, the big risk there is animal fecal matter, animal poop, that can have some pretty gross, nasty pathogens, bacteria and viruses in it that can make folks sick if that makes its way onto fresh produce. So that's why animals are kind of a focus of this produce safety rule. What you're going to want to do in thinking about animals on the farm, whether they're wild animals or domesticated animals, is think about some pre-planting and pre-harvest assessments. Both of those can be tools to minimize risks of either animal intrusion or potential runoff from animal operations that may be nearby. The animals being in the farm environment is not a bad thing necessarily. It does not mean that what you're growing is contaminated. It just means that you have a bigger risk of having some contaminated produce. The big thing to remember here is just that workers need to be trained and they need to know that nothing gets harvested that has animal poop on it. But other than that, you've got some flexibility in the steps that you're taking to reduce risks from animals, whether that's deterring animals through netting or fencing or noisemakers or what have you. And if you do see animal intrusion that occurs, you're just going to want to document all of that and document all of the corrective actions that you take to reduce the risk of animal intrusion or the risk of contamination from animals on the farm. So with that, I think, yep. We've got another webinar August 9th. That'll be on post-harvest handling. You can register for that webinar on our website, nativeFoodSafety.org. That URL is there on your screen. And I think with that, I have some time for some questions if anybody has questions about this. If you don't have a question now and one occurs to you later, or you don't feel comfortable asking a question now and you want to reach out to us directly, you can send us a message through this, or you can email me directly. I'm sorry, my email isn't up here on the screen, but you can reach me at eschirl@uark.edu. That's ESHIRL at uark.edu. That's me. And you can send me an email about any kind of food safety question you have, and I'll be happy to chat with you about it. But Nikki, if we've got any questions, I will take them now.
So far we don't have any. Just want to remind everybody you can ask questions in the question panel on the control panel. That's a little tab you can select.
Yeah, and I will remind everybody too, I don't think we don't have any upcoming in-person trainings on the books. I know we're working on scheduling one in Florida sometime soon, but if doing a full produce safety training is something that you want or need, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to work with you and get something scheduled for us to come out to directly and be in your community and do a food safety training. And we do that. That's a no-cost service that we provide. We're a free resource for you in food safety.
All right, with no questions, I'm going to thank everybody for coming out and listening to us today. And thank you, Erin, for presenting.
Right.
And
Oh, I was just going to say thanks, everybody, and I hope you join us on August 9th for the next webinar.
Yep. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.